In 1912, on the narrow neck of land between Cape Cod Bay and Buzzards Bay, a worker stood beside a temporary railroad track while a steam shovel bit into the sand in front of him. The machine could dig, but it could not solve the whole problem. Every load had to be dropped into a dump car. Every dump car had to be hauled away. Every track had to be moved again as the cut widened, and all of it was happening inside a landscape that was not rock, not city pavement, and not a stable dry trench. It was sand, marsh, groundwater, tidal rivers, shifting spoil banks, and two bodies of salt water waiting to be joined. The canal they were trying to build would eventually run about 17 miles across Cape Cod. It would open in 1914 as a private toll waterway. It was planned as a sea-level canal without locks, even though the tides at each end were out of phase by nearly 3 hours and differed by about 4.5 to 5 feet. Its original controlling depth was only about 15 feet when it opened, even though the charter called for 25 feet. There were no modern hydraulic excavators, no GPS-guided dredges, no computerized tide modeling on the job site. No modern earth-moving fleets that could make a canal through sand look routine. The old method was a chain of steam shovels, narrow-gauge railroads, dump cars, breakwater stone, dipper dredges, dams, pumps, and men standing close enough to the moving cut to keep the system working. The question was simple. How did workers cut Cape Cod into an island before modern canal-building machines existed? The reason for the canal was written in wreckage. Before the Cape Cod Canal, ships moving along the New England coast had to sail around the outer cape. That route could be costly, slow, and dangerous. Cape Cod juts into the Atlantic like a bent arm, and the waters around it were notorious for storms, shoals, fog, and wrecks. ASCE notes that in the 2 decades before 1915, more than 135 ships were wrecked, 63 lives were lost, and $1.6 million in cargo was destroyed by vessels trying to travel around the Cape. A canal promised to remove that exposure. Instead of sending ships around the dangerous outer shore, it would cut through the narrow isthmus between Buzzards Bay and Cape Cod Bay. The idea was centuries old. People had looked at the geography since the 1600s and understood the temptation. 2 small river valleys already pointed toward each other, the Monument River flowing southwest toward Buzzards Bay, and the Scusset River flowing northeast toward Cape Cod Bay. Between them, little more than a mile of land, no more than about 33 feet above sea level, separated the waters. On a map, it looked almost as if nature had started a canal and then stopped. But the physical reality was much harsher. The workers did not only need to connect 2 rivers. They had to carve a navigable ship channel through earth that could cave, slump, flood, and refill with sand. They had to build approaches at each end. They had to handle tidal water that would not wait politely for completion. They had to move millions of small loads of material with machines that still depended on rail tracks, cables, men, and repeated adjustment. And they had to make a sea-level canal work without locks. That choice mattered. A lock canal controls water levels by putting vessels into chambers and raising or lowering them between different elevations. A sea-level canal avoids that machinery, but it accepts a different problem. The water at both ends can behave differently. At Cape Cod, the tides of Buzzards Bay and Cape Cod Bay did not rise and fall together. They were nearly 3 hours out of phase, and the difference could drive strong currents through the finished channel. William Barclay Parsons, the engineer who had also worked on New York's first subway, believed the canal could use those currents rather than fight them completely. The moving water would help prevent ice formation and reduce maintenance problems. But, before that theory could become a canal, workers had to create the ditch that would let the tide run. That is where the job became physical. Construction began in June 1909. On the east end, schooners arrived from Maine, carrying granite for a breakwater. The rock had to be transferred to smaller, lighters, and dropped into place. This was the first kind of old canal work, not digging, but protecting the future entrance from waves, shoaling, and coastal force. On the west end, dredges were towed into Buzzards Bay to begin the approach channel. In the middle, the company turned to dry excavation. Steam shovels dug in the exposed land of the isthmus. Narrow-gauge railroad tracks were laid along the canal route.
Dump cars carried excavated material away to spoil areas beside the cut. The method sounds organized, but it was a moving machine, made from temporary parts. A steam shovel could bite into the bank, swing, and drop material into a car. But the car had to be under the bucket. The track had to reach the shovel. The track had to stay level enough for loaded cars. The spoil banks had to receive the material.
And as the cut advanced, the whole track system had to be moved. Picture a worker standing beside rails laid on raw sand. The shovel bucket swings overhead with wet material inside it. A dump car waits below. The track under his boots is not permanent railroad. It is temporary construction lifeline. If the rails sink or shift, the cars stop. If the cars stop, the shovel has nowhere to dump. If the shovel has nowhere to dump, the canal stops growing. That is the hidden rule of excavation. Digging is only useful if removal keeps pace. The Cape Cod Canal was not one big hole made by one big machine. It was a logistics system spread across sand and water. Every yard removed from the cut became a second job somewhere else. It had to be loaded, moved, dumped, and kept out of the way while the next yard was taken. The early pace was not enough. The canal company began falling behind schedule. Steam shovels and ordinary dredges were working, but the task was too large and the ground too inconvenient. August Belmont wanted the canal finished, and the project needed bigger tools. So the company ordered 2 large dipper dredges from the American Locomotive Company. These dredges were not elegant. They were floating digging machines. A dipper dredge uses a large bucket or dipper on a boom, driven by steam machinery, to bite into material underwater or at the edge of a cut. It pulls the bucket toward itself, lifts the load, swings, and dumps the material into scows or disposal areas. The dredge did one violent job again and again. Bite, pull, lift, swing, dump, reset. The Governor Herrick was assembled on the east end at Sagamore. The Governor Warfield was prepared on the west end at Buzzards Bay. By August 1912, these huge machines began digging toward each other in the final phase of canal construction. That gave the project a new rhythm. The land cut, the dredged approaches, and the tidal valleys were no longer separate dreams. They were being forced into one continuous waterway. But a dredge did not replace the worker. It multiplied the amount of force workers had to control. A man on a dredge deck stood among cables, engines, wet surfaces, swinging buckets, scows, and signals. He could not treat the machine as background. The bucket was heavy even when empty. Loaded with sand, clay, or wet spoil, it became a moving mass that could crush anything in its path. A cable under tension could snap. A scow could shift. A wrong signal could send material where men were standing. The canal was being dubbed by machines, but the machines were still operated by bodies. And those bodies worked at the edge of water. That mattered because the Cape Cod Canal was not simply dry earth moving. It was a staged invasion of water into land. Workers had to keep parts of the cut dry or controlled while other parts were dredged wet. They had to use dams to separate sections. They had to manage groundwater. They had to decide when 2 bodies of water could safely be allowed to meet. The last barrier became Foley's Dike. By April 1914, only that dam separated the waters of Cape Cod Bay from Buzzards Bay. Belmont and Parsons marked the moment ceremonially by blending bottles of water from both bays before opening a final sluiceway. The waters first trickled through. The real removal of Foley's Dike came on July 4th, 1914. That image is almost too clean. 2 waters meet. The canal is nearly complete. Everyone shakes hands. But behind that moment were years of shovels, rails, dredges, dump cars, breakwater stone, temporary dams, and workers whose job was to keep the cut from becoming chaos before it became a channel. The meeting of the waters was not the end of danger. It created the next enemy, current. A sea-level canal, without locks, turns tide into a machine. When one end of the canal is higher than the other, water moves. When the tides are out of phase, that movement can be strong. ASC notes that average high tide waters can move through the Cape Cod Canal at 4 to 5 miles per hour, with tides under a full moon or other conditions increasing the current to 7 miles per hour or more. For navigation, that mattered. For construction, it mattered too. Once water moved through the cut, the canal was no longer just an excavation site. It became a tidal throat. Banks had to resist erosion. Bottom material had to resist shoaling. Structures near the entrances had to handle changing flow. The channel had to be deep enough, wide enough, and controlled enough for ships to trust it. The original private canal opened on July 29, 1914, before it was fully finished to its intended depth. Belmont had chosen to open with a controlling depth of about 15 feet, so revenue could begin while deepening continued. The canal was officially completed in April 1916. That decision shows the commercial pressure on the project. The canal had to be a physical passage, but it also had to pay for itself. Opening early mint ships could begin using it. It also meant the first canal was narrower, shallower, and more difficult than the later federal canal people know today. There was another physical problem that arrived the moment the canal became real. Roads and railroads still had to cross the cut. Before the canal, Cape Cod was attached to the mainland by land routes. Once workers opened the waterway, the same project that made a shortcut for ships created a barrier for people, carts, trains, and local travel. A canal is never only a channel. It is also a severing line. That meant bridges became part of the system. The early canal used movable bridges, including spans that had to open for vessels and close for land traffic. This created one of the most difficult operating conditions in the original waterway. A vessel entering a narrow tidal canal could not behave like a cart waiting at a gate. It had current under it, wind on it, and limited room to correct course. If the bridge opening was not ready, the mariner had to fight the current in a confined channel while waiting for machinery and operators above. For workers and bridge tenders, that meant the canal did not stop being a machine after construction. It became a time machine. The current moved whether the bridge was ready or not. The vessel approached whether the roadway was clear or not. The span had to open, traffic had to stop, signals had to be read, and the ship had to pass through a space that was far less forgiving than open water. This is part of why mariners feared the first canal. The danger had changed shape. Sailing around the outer cape meant storms, shoals, and distance. Using the canal meant current, narrow width, bridge openings, and the pressure of steering a vessel through a man-made throat. Picture a crewman on a vessel entering the early canal. The banks are close. The water is not still. Ahead, a bridge span marks the point where land traffic and water traffic compete for the same opening. He cannot widen the channel by wishing. He cannot stop the tide. He watches lines, helm, engine, bridge signal, and bank all at once. The canal has saved miles, but it has not made navigation effortless. That is why later federal improvements mattered so much. They did not prove the canal could exist. Belmont's workers had already done that. They made the canal safer and more useful after the first version revealed its weaknesses. Mariners did not automatically trust it. Strong currents, narrow bridge openings, and accidents created fear. Ships could avoid the outer cape, but now they had to navigate a new kind of danger, a fast tidal channel with limited room for error. Several serious accidents caused closures. Traffic grew, but not enough to make Belmont's private canal the financial success its investors had hoped for. This is one of the most useful lessons in old infrastructure. Building the passage is not the same as solving the passage. The workers had cut the canal. The engineers had proven that water could move through it. Ships had begun using it. But the first version still had to be widened, deepened, straightened, and made safer before it became the reliable Cape Cod Canal of modern memory. After World War I and several years of debate, The federal government purchased the canal in 1927 for $11.5 million. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took over operation in 1928 and began a major improvement program. The private canal was redesigned and reconstructed in the 1930s into the basic infrastructure seen today. That later work included larger dimensions and new bridges, but the original 1909 to 1914 construction remains the BBM story. Because the first canal answered the hardest question: could the Cape actually be cut through it all? The answer was yes, but not because one machine arrived and solved everything. It took a whole system. Breakwater stone protected the entrances. Dredges opened the approaches. Steam shovels attacked the dry middle. Narrow-gauge railroads removed spoil. Dipper dredges bit through the final sections. Dams held back water until the time came to release it. Workers moved tracks, handled cables, guided dump cars, maintained machines, stood on floating platforms, and kept the excavation moving from both ends. That is what the finished canal hides. Today, a person standing beside the Cape Cod Canal sees a wide federal waterway with paved service roads, bridges, ships, fishing spots, and strong tidal current. It looks permanent, almost natural, as if the Cape always had a clean, straight passage through it. But it did not. The canal is a scar made useful. It is the place where a peninsula became an island because workers cut a waterway through the neck. And the original scar was made with tools that now feel strangely heavy and fragile at the same time. A steam shovel had power, but it was tied to rails, fuel, operators, and dump cars. A narrow-gauge track was efficient, but only while the ground held it. A dipper dredge could remove underwater material, but only one bucket at a time. A breakwater could protect an entrance, but only if stones were placed correctly from vessels shifting on water. A dam could hold two bodies of water apart, but only until workers decided the cut was ready to become a canal. The project was a choreography of temporary systems, temporary railroads, temporary dams, temporary spoil routes, temporary dredge positions, temporary work camps and machine shops, temporary labor around a permanent line of water. That is why the Cape Cod Canal belongs in the memory of work before modern machines. It was not built by hand alone, and it was not built by modern automation. It sits in the middle, an early 20th century earth-moving project where steam power could bite into the land, but human coordination still decided whether the machine made progress. Think about the worker moving track beside the cut. He is not posing for a photograph. He is keeping the excavation alive. The rails must be close enough for cars to receive spoil, but far enough from the bank not to collapse into the trench. The dump car must be loaded, moved, emptied, and returned. The shovel must keep swinging. The bank must not slump into the work faster than the machine can remove it. Think about the dredge worker on the deck. He hears the engine, feels the deck shift, watches the bucket vanish below the surface, and waits for the cable to tighten. He cannot see exactly what the bucket is biting. He sees the result only when it breaks the surface: sand, mud, weed, stone, water spilling from the load. The canal advances through what the machine brings up. Think about the men at Foley's Dike. For years, the project had been about keeping earth and water separated in useful ways. Then the final act was to undo that separation. Open the sluiceway. Let the waters trickle. Remove the dike. Allow the tides to become the canal's engine. That is a different kind of construction. Not only building something, but deciding when to let nature into what you built. Before that release, the job had another unglamorous enemy: keeping the whole temporary construction system alive long enough to finish. Steam shovels needed fuel, water, repair crews, replacement parts, and clear working faces. Dredges needed engines, buckets, cables, bearings, scows, anchors, and men who understood how a floating machine behaved when the bottom changed underneath it. Narrow-gauge railroads needed ties, rails, switches, cars, and constant realignment. Spoil banks had to be managed so removed material did not slide back toward the cut or block the next phase of excavation. That maintenance work rarely becomes the famous part of a canal. But without it, the canal stops. A broken cable can silence a dredge. A shifted rail can strand loaded cars. A clogged pump can turn a dry excavation into a wet hole. A failed timber support can make a bank slump before the machine finishes the next bite. The workers closest to those failures did not experience the canal as a grand line across Cape Cod. They experienced it as the next immediate problem: a rail joint to reset, a bucket tooth to repair, a bank to watch, a line to handle, a car to dump, a machine to grease, a wet section to pump down before the shovel could reach it. Picture a mechanic beside a steam shovel after dark. The machine that looked powerful in daylight is now a collection of hot metal, worn pins, cable, soot, grease, and loose sand around its tracks. Tomorrow it has to dig again. If it does not, the dump cars wait. If the dump cars wait, the spoil route fails. If the spoil route fails, the canal becomes an unfinished trench with expensive machinery sitting inside it. This is why old construction projects depended on systems, not just machines. The steam shovel was only useful because men kept feeding it work. The dredge was only useful because scows and disposal routes kept carrying material away. The temporary railroad was only useful because crews kept moving it as the ground disappeared. The canal was not cut by isolated acts of digging. It was cut by thousands of acts that kept the digging possible. The modern contrast makes the old work clearer. Today, a major canal excavation can use GPS machine control, hydraulic excavators, cutter suction dredges, geotechnical surveys, sonar mapping, environmental monitoring, and massive haulage systems. Operators can see quantities, grades, positions, and progress with tools the Cape Cod crews did not have. But the old crews still had to answer the same basic physical questions. Where does the material go? How do you keep the cut open? How do you move machines through unstable ground? How do you protect the entrances? How do you control water until water becomes useful? How do you make ships trust the passage? The Cape Cod Canal's first builders answered with steam, rail, dredges, stone, and repetition. And when the canal opened in 1914, it did something simple and enormous. It let vessels avoid the long, dangerous trip around the outer cape. It shortened coastal navigation. It created a new maritime shortcut through a place people had imagined cutting for almost 3 centuries. It turned a dangerous geography into a controlled passage, even if the first version still needed years of improvement. That is the legacy hidden under the modern waterway. The canal you see today is broader and safer because later federal work rebuilt it. But the original act still matters. Before the Corps improved it, before the modern bridges became the recognizable skyline, before the canal became a familiar New England landmark, workers had to prove that the Cape could be opened. They did it by moving sand. Not once, not in one dramatic blast, but bucket by bucket, car by car, rail shift by rail shift, dredge bite by dredge bite. The next time you see a canal, do not look only at the water. Look at the banks. Look at the straightness. Look at the spoil areas, the bridges, the currents, the places where the land seems too cleanly cut to be natural. Ask what temporary systems vanished so the permanent water could remain. Would you have trusted a sea-level canal with tides pulling from both ends? Would you have worked beside a steam shovel while the ground under the track kept changing? And if there's an old canal, harbor entrance, dredge channel, breakwater, or abandoned navigation cut near your town, tell me which one deserves its own hidden construction story. Because the Cape Cod Canal was not simply dug. It was forced to open through sand, tide, current, steam, rail, and human repetition until 2 separate waters finally became one working road for ships.